So I want to build a new Rails website, and I want to, I'll create a really quick seed script that'll probably just use Faker to fill out some fake data. And I want to do two things. I want to implement a really simple search to allow the user, by way of a search field, to search for records in the database. And then I also want to look a little bit into styling, CSS-based styling, so how we can go about styling a Rails-based website. So we will start by way of creating a new Rails app. So at my console here, I'm in my C full stack Rails folder. Wondering what kind of website I will make. Maybe a beer website. Yeah, okay. I've got beer names in here. It's probably all I need. I also want to, usually when I'm about to use something with Faker, I want to see like how big of a data source Faker has for that particular thing. Because if it's, if it's really small, then I probably won't use it. So you can always go to the lib locales folder and then to the en folder, and you can look at any one of the data sets and see how big of a list it has. That seems reasonable. Yeah, so I've got brands, I've got names. That'll be enough for me to fake out this data. So I'll do a Rails new beer app, and I will hit enter. That will create all of my folders and files that I need. It will make sure that Bundle has grabbed the latest versions of all the required gems. And I will navigate to the beer app folder. And if I do a git status, I will see that a bunch of files are in need of being added and committed. Initial commit of the beer app. I can now add to VS Code the folder that was generated, like so. We'll go back and record here. So when I tried to run Rails C, I got an error, and I imagine other people may also get this same error, which mentions SQLite 3 and the difference between 1.4.0 and the 1.3 variant. And a temporary fix before we know the full fix here is to go into the gem file and specify the old version of the gem. And so we are using we are using 1.3.13. The error message mentioned 1.3.6 for some reason. I'll put in that 1.3.6. It'll probably end up using 1.3.13 in sort of gem file language. This little squiggly greater than means use the version specified, but feel free to increase this last number. And so that way you can lock a gem to like a major point release, but not to like a patch release. So it'll probably just end up using the 1.3.13 that I have on my system. So I've gone into the gem file. On line 9 is where SQLite 3 is mentioned. I added a comma, and then in single quotes, squiggle, I guess that's a tilde, greater than space 1.3.6. And then I need to do a bundle update SQLite 3 to specify that I've changed the version. And it should tell me that it was using 1.4 and it's now using 1.3 after I run this, hopefully. Bundle updated. And where's my SQLite in here? don't see it. Oh yeah, SQLite 3, and now we're using 1.3.13. Let's see if I do a Rails C again. It worked. Yeah, it's weird. It says it attempted to update, but it stayed the same, but it seems to have fixed the problem. So again, I'm not sure why, but that might just be because 1.4 is a brand new release of the gem, and it's maybe conflicting a little bit with the latest version of Rails. Oh, to add to Git was I did a Git add and a dot just to add everything. And then once I did a Git add dot, I did a Git commit with a commit message inside of quotes after a -m. Okay, and the whole reason I wanted to get into that Rails console is I wanted to see how many beers Faker had for me. And so I will go back to the Faker gem and copy and paste the list of beers and just count them. Okay, 54 beers. That seems reasonable. Okay, so I don't actually need to be at the console for that. I now want to create a new model, and then I'm going to scaffold up some database tables associated with that model. So I'll do a Rails generate model beer. You don't have to do a capital B in beer, but I tend to write it that way because that's how it's going to end up as a model. It'll work with a lowercase. And then a beer is going to have a name, which is a string. And what else do I have in terms of beers here? What does Faker beer give me? Faker beer. I have an alcohol percentage. Alcohol. Make that a string. I guess I can make that a numeric value instead of a string, decimal. I will give it an IBU. I'll make that a integer. No, I'll make that a string because it's a string in there. I'm just trying to keep things simple. Because Faker gives me everything as strings, I'm just going to keep everything as strings otherwise I'd have to sort of mangle those strings into appropriate numbers. So I've got a name as a string, an alcohol amount as a string, an IBU as a string, and I will pick a price as a decimal. So string for the first three, decimal for the price. As I've mentioned, I believe as I mentioned in the past, maybe I haven't mentioned to this section, when working with prices in a real e-commerce application, you probably wouldn't want to use a decimal or a floating point number. You'd probably want to use integers so that you could capture a whole number of cents so that you wouldn't be susceptible to any rounding errors. Floating point numbers in all programming languages are only as accurate as the IEEE standard for floating point numbers. So you don't really want a number that has a level of accuracy when you're dealing with money. You want a fully accurate thing, which a whole number of cents would be that fully accurate thing. There's a really nice gem that I tend to use when making commercial websites. It's just called money. Yeah. Ooh, that's a weird networking error. Are you plugged in? Oh, I'll have to come and look at that. You might just have to watch for now, because has that happened to you before or not? Okay, we'll look into that. I'm going to run Rails DB migrate to create the beers table. And then I'm going to go into the app models folder and pull out the beer model, and I'll just add some validations. So I'll say like validates that the name, and what else did I give this? Basically, I'm going to just say that the presence is alcohol and IBU. Yeah, so name, alcohol, IBU, and price, that those all have a presence of true. And I'll validate that the price has a numericality of true. Numericality, yeah. That's a validation right there. And I will use VS Code to submit these changes. So I will queue them all up like so. And then I will say added a beer model with validations. Oh, I should probably unstage the gem file changes and stage those, commit those separately. And then I will now fix a SQLite 3 error by locking the gem to the 1.3.x version. Okay, so that's nice. I have a model, I have an associated table. I'm going to go into the gem file and add faker into the gem file so that I can sort of fake out the data that's required. I'm going to put that into the development block because I only need faker in development mode. And so in the faker docs, it shows you what you want to put in there, which is this big long list here, having faker being pulled from GitHub. And after adding that, I'm going to need to run bundle install again. And that'll just install that one new gem. That's nice. I can go here and say added the faker gem for writing the seed script. And now I'm going to do that. I'm going to go write the seed script. Yeah, you need to do a bundle install. Yeah. And that'll look to the gem file and see that we have added a new gem, and it'll install it. So the difference between the two is bundle update will, if you've changed any versions, it'll update the versions. Bundle install will just install new gems and keep the versions locked at whatever they were when they were first installed, which is important. You don't want the versions of your gems to sort of change under your feet. Okay. In the DB folder, I'm going to pull up my seed script, and I'm going to generate 50 beers for my database. At the top here, I'll do a beer.destroy all so I can run this a few times without repeating. And then I will say beer.create. And a beer has a name, and it has an alcohol, and it has an IBU, and it has a price. So for each one of those, I need to go to faker, beer, unique.name, faker, beer.alcohol. Oh, I need a comma there and a comma there. faker beer.ibu, and then I need to go to like maybe the commerce one for a price. So I'll quickly look on the faker site to make sure I'm using the correct generators there. I think I am. I'll just go to the beer section. Here is beer. Name, IBU, alcohol, and now I'm going to go to faker commerce. And I want a price. And let's say that these beers will range from $2 to $10, maybe even more. We're going to have a $20 beer. Okay, and as string false. And I need a final end for my block. Nope, that was my end already. No problem. So I'm going to run this. Just let me run it and see if it works or not, and then you can run yours after we've checked to see if this is actually a thing that'll work. So I can run Rails DB seed. I guess at the very end of the script I should confirm that 50 beers were created, so I can put out beers in database, and then I can go to beer.count. Nice, 50 beers were generated. So that is my seed script. Faker for basically all the things. And that gives me a data set that I can now create a controller for, and I'll just make a very simple controller. I'll make a controller that has a index page, a show page, and I guess I'll just add it right to the controller, maybe like a search results page. There's an argument to be made that I could make a whole either controller, like a search controller. Maybe I'll do that. Sort of like separate out the two things. Okay, so yeah, let's do that. Let's make two different controllers. Rails generate. Maybe I'll wait. I'll do a get beer seed script, and then I'll do a Rails generate controller beers, and I want an index and a show. So that was this line right here, Rails G controller. It's a beers controller with an index and a show action. And then I'm going to do a Rails generate controller search. The first one? Yeah, it was, oh, where did it go? It was beers, index, and show. And then after the beers controller, I'm going to do a search controller, and it only needs a results. Let's say results. I'll make it so that the search bar itself, like the search form, is present on every page. I'll just put it on the application layout, and so when that form is submitted, it needs to go to one place and one place only, which is the search results action. So I will run that one as well. Added the beers and search controller. So a few files I want to open up. I will want to go to the config folder and open up the routing file, which is routes.rb. And I want to remove all of the routes that were put in there for me. And I will start by asking for resources for beers and only the index. I'll just start with just the index. Keep things simple, and if we have more time, we'll add to it. Because we've already seen me create index and shows a bunch of times now, so we'll stick with index, and if we have time, we'll implement the show. I'll implement that first, and then we'll go back and implement the search stuff. And then the next files that I will want to open are going to be in the app controllers folder. And one thing you should note is, like, whenever I'm opening these files, I'm always doing it by way of the file picker, because it slows me down a little bit. I tend to go a little fast sometimes in class, and it sort of shows you where the files are located. If I was coding on my own, I would not be using the file picker. I'd be using the fuzzy finder all the time. And so remember, the fuzzy finder is our control P, and then you just start typing what you want to get. So if I wanted in the controllers folder, I guess the one that I'm going to be working with right now, which is the beers controller, then I would say con beer, and that would help me find the beers controller, because it would look for a folder that had con in it and then something that had beers in it. So it's usually the fuzzy finder that I turn to when I'm opening and closing tabs, when I'm not coding in front of other people. When I am coding in front of other people, to give a better idea of where these files are located, I use the Explorer. In the routing file, get rid of the gets that were put in there for you and replace them with the resources beers only index. And then in the views folder, I will open up the beers subfolder and further the index html.erb. So I'm going to fill out the index here, which is, I want to get all my beers by going to the beers and maybe ordering by price. I think this will default to ascending order. And then, like all controllers, the instance variables that we create within the controller get shared with the associated view. So the beers variable will be shared with the app views beers index.html.erb. Yeah. It freezes. Oh, that's like it paginates itself, so you have to hit Q to get out of that, yeah, to get out of that mode. Yeah, so if you have multiple things in there, it sort of shows them page by page. You can navigate with page up and page down and the arrow keys, but yeah, the only way out is Q. So there's that's really all I need in my controller for now. If I hop over to the index, I can say tasty beers for sale in the H1. And then I can list said beers by doing this. Maybe I won't use a UL for this one. I will just go to my beers variable and navigate each beer. And then here I'll do like an H3 where I will use the beer name. And below that, I will put the price of the beer, which will be the, here I'm going to use a currency formatter. I'll show you before and after. So this is before, I'm just putting the raw price in. And then alcohol will be dot alcohol. And last but not least, the IBU, the bitterness unit, beer.IBU. And because we're going to get into a little bit of styling later on, it might be nice to maybe put this into a div with a class of beer, and we could later apply some styling to that entry. So this is my full loop, using an each loop, temporarily calling each beer beer, and then pulling out and echoing out the name, the price, the alcohol, and the IBU. I need to run the Rails server now at the terminal because I want to see this thing in action now, see if my index page is working. And I'll just come check it out and then I'll come back to my code. So let me just quickly check it out, /beers. And there we are, that's looking good. Oh yeah, still have that problem on here, eh? It did order ascending, yeah. So the cheapest beer is $2 for the double bastard ale. And then all the way up to a 1904 for the two-hearted ale. And so those are my beers. Go back here, this is the code that produced that. And I can create a new console here for more Git stuff. Okay, with that in place, I now want to implement a quick little search. So I want a form, and I want that form to have two elements inside of it. One's going to be an input where someone can put some search text. The other one's going to be like a submit button where you could submit your search. Those are going to go into the application layout. In the Rails guides, there is a example of searching, or at least building a search form in the action view form helpers section. So like a lot of things in ERB, we tend to, in certain cases at least, have Rails generate HTML for us rather than manually writing it out ourselves. Oh, the one thing I did mention earlier is that I was going to format the price as a number. See if this is, if there's any of the prices ending with a 0, where it would be. So here, for example, this beer's price is $9.90, but because it's a number, let me see this a bit larger. It's just coming out as 9.9, right? So that you would not want that to be how you display $9.90. That's not how we're used to seeing it. And so in the view here, we have a nice little helper called number to currency. So in front of the beer price, I just write number underscore to underscore currency. There's a bunch of these number to helpers that Rails offers. If you go to the API and you search for number underscore to, you'll see all the nice little helpers that Rails makes available to you. And if I reload this, the Founder's Breakfast Stout is now got a $sign in front of it, and it's properly padding the rightmost 0 onto the end of it. So that was this change right here. Yep. Oh, you have to go to /beers. We can fix that though. We can create a root route. So if we go here, we can say root to beers index, and now your root route will properly go to the list of beers. Thanks. That's always a nice thing to do, is to get rid of that welcome message. So I'll test that out. My root to beers hashmark index should Rails space S. And there we are. We have our root route in place. And yeah, it's just beers hashmark index. So it's really which controller, and then after the hash, which action we want to route to. Oh, you maybe haven't run Rails DB migrate. So over at the Rails guides, we have the action form helpers that I loaded up. And the very top example that they give you is how to make a generic search form. And so we can actually just copy and paste the content from there. So again, I went to guides.rubyonrails.org. I scrolled down until I got to the section on views, and then I looked for the action view form helpers. So we have little helpers that generate forms for us. And then there's a section that says a generic search form. If I double click on the example, it allows me to copy and paste that. And I'm going to put that into my application layout. So that's in my views layouts folder, the application file. And I'll just put that straight above the yield here. You can see it's using a form tag helper that's being echoed out to the screen. The method of submission for the form is being set to get. So that will put the method on the form tag as get. I'm going to replace this right here with a route that I'm going to create myself that's going to route to my search controller. But at least for now, you can see here, it's got a label that says search for, a text field tag, which is going to drop an input, and a submit tag, which is going to drop a submit button, and a label, which uses the same key, uses the same symbol as the text field tag, so that label will be associated with the text field, meaning that screen readers will be able to properly pick up the fact that it says search for associated with that particular input. If I save this and I go back to my site, I should see that form appear up at the top there. Clicking it doesn't yet do anything, right? I don't have the right route yet. But at least I've got my search form. So that's this. I want this form to submit to the search controller. I want the search controller to do the work and to display the answers. Yep. I want it to be present. Eventually, if I have other pages, I would like this form to be present at the top of all pages. Yeah, so anything you put in this application layout file is going to appear with every single view. So each view gets injected where the yield keyword is, and that way I'll always, if this application was built out over a bunch of pages, that the search form would be present on all of them. So I've got a search controller. It has a results action. In my routing file, I'm going to set up a route for that. And what I'm going to do is, this is one of those cases where maybe if I thought long and hard about it, I could figure out how to make this search controller and its actions sort of map to the RESTful routes. But I mean, it doesn't really in my mind, so I can just do a hard-coded, I can say like a get request to /search should route to, or maybe search, get request / what do I want it to be? Maybe search results? Should route to the search controller's results action, and I want this route to be known as search results. So I set it up as a get request because that's how that form is being set up to submit its data. If the form was being set up to submit by way of a post, my route would need to match that. So the route always matches when you do a manual route like this, it matches which HTTP verb is being used, the URL, where it's going to, and what it's going to be known as. And once I have this in place, I can go and fix up the form to properly use this route by way of the routing system. So here, instead of hard coding it to /search, I'm going to say go to the search results path. Because search results is what I named it with the as, and when I want to retrieve that, I always just use that with an underscore path at the end of it. This Q here is going to be where the data ends up inside of my get parameters. I'll probably change it in a moment away from Q. Maybe I'll call it query or something to be a little bit more descriptive, but I'll leave it like that for now. And I will just make sure that this page still loads up without any errors, and that when I click this button, it takes me to the search results view that already exists. And already you can see that there's some stuff put up into the URL in terms of URL parameters. Sort of hard to read. I'll paste it into code so we can see it again. And if I try a test query in here and click search, that ends up in my URL as well. So we'll go see what that looks like. I will drop that into a comment here. Take the whole URL. I'll just say when the form is submitted with the input as test query, it results in. You can see we are going to that search results path. So it's going to /search results. But because it's a get, it's pushing it into the get parameters. So this is more used to, like, we're used to this style of get parameters from PHP. You can see here we have Q equals test query, and that's because this is a queue here. So if I change this word to query, then this URL would change and it would say query equals. The other thing you want to note is, it's sort of hard to see up here, but part of the get parameters, it says UTF-8 equals, and there's a check mark there. What Rails is doing is it's going to check to see if the browser that's being used for submission purposes actually supports UTF-8 encoding, and it does so by using a UTF-8 character, the check mark, and so that when Rails receives this to the search results controller, it can do a quick test to see, am I dealing with a new browser or an old browser? What's the encoding type? And it can sort of help us along those lines. In the early days of Rails, they didn't use a check mark. They used the Unicode snowman. And in later versions of Rails, as Rails started to get more professional, they thought that that wasn't a very professional thing to put into the search bar. So they changed it to the check mark. But I liked the snowman. And so now at the search controller, I'm getting to this results action. It's not doing anything yet, but for example, if I wanted to grab that query, I could go to the params action to position Q, and that would give me access to the query that the user submitted. And then I could use that in the associated view to say something like, oh, your search for query resulted in n number of results. So I'm putting it into an instance variable so that that will be accessible to the view. And I can go to the associated view. I can go to the search results page. I can change that H1 to say search results. And then inside of an H2, I can say your query for, and I can inject the query resulted in n results. We don't know the number of results yet, so I'll just put a placeholder in for that for right now. So here I'm using the query that was captured from the params hash in the controller into the query instance variable. So we can test this out. I should be able to run a test query, and it says your query for test query resulted in number of results, beer, the word beer goes in there, wat, the word wat goes in there. So anything I submit is now properly making it into the controller by way of this params. We pull it out of the get parameters by name. The Q here represents the Q here, right? So if I had had the word query here, then I would have to have the word query here. And now I can actually do the search, which is what we wanted all along, right? So I can say beers found equals, and I can go to the beers, and I can do a where. And I need like a wildcard search here. And so I'm gonna have to step into doing a little bit of raw SQL. Wildcard searches in SQL are done with the like operator, and the wildcard character is the %. And so I can say inside of single quotes, Yeah. I can say where name like question mark. And here the question mark is not me just putting a placeholder in there. It's actually part of a parameterized search. I don't want to just take what the user has submitted, the query here, and inject it directly into my SQL query, because that is a recipe for a SQL injection attack, right? Anytime you take user input and put it directly into a SQL query, you're opening yourself up to a security hole. Rails, or Active Record specifically though, supports parameterized queries that have SQL injection protection. So you put a question mark there, meaning like this is data coming from the outside world. And then after, we're going to specify what that data actually is, and Rails will sanitize it and properly make sure it doesn't lead to a SQL injection attack. What I want it to be is I want it to be the user's query with wildcards on either side of it. So I want percentages on either side of what the user submitted, because I want to look for the word or words that they submitted inside anywhere within the name. So I will take a string, I will put 2 wildcard characters into it, and then I will interpolate into that the query. And so Rails will take this and properly inject it here in a safe manner, preventing my SQL injection from occurring. I'll come back to my code. I just want to make sure that this doesn't throw an error. So I'll just run a test. No errors thrown. We're still not displaying any results, but that's fine. What do you mean?
Like, so we're doing if you have something into that query, you do the backspace, I believe.
I see what you mean. I don't think so. I see what you're getting at, but I don't think that would be possible. I don't know if the browser would even submit that. And now over on the results page, I want to display all the beers that were found. Maybe I'll just shorten this to beers instead of beers found. And in that way, I can be a little bit lazy and I can go to my index and I can just copy and paste this code over to the results page. So I'm going to take these lines here and I'm going to paste them over here. If that feels a little bit weird to you to have like a big chunk of code replicated in 2 places, in a moment we will remove that duplication, but for now we're just going to have that wholesale copied and pasted into the search results. So let's see if this is working. If I go back to my my home page, I can see the names of some of the so if I wanted to, for example, search for all the stouts, I could put the word stout in my search, and it tells me the query for stout resulted in, I still haven't put the results number up, but you can see I've got all the stouts being displayed. I search for like aged, I get an aged Yeti Imperial Stout. If I search for oak, I get some other things. Ale gets me a bunch of different results as well. So it looks like my search results are working. I might like to actually specify how many results. That's just going to be the size of the beers collection. And so I will say, I will inject in pluralize beers.size result. and then get rid of the word results at the end there. This handles the proper pluralization of the word result. So if only one result was found, it will say resulted in one result. That's an awkward way of saying it, resulted in one result. How would I better word this? Return, nice. Yes, that's what I will say. Your query for returned end results. That's much better worded. Returned. Your query for query returned, and then we'll properly pluralize the word results based on the size of the collection. So it'll say one result or two or more results. I'll quickly just test that out here. So ale gives me 11 results. What had ale had one, or aged? Oh, so does whatever I just searched for there. Alpha has one result, and then ale has many results. I really want to try that beer now. And that is a simple search system. I'm gonna go to Git and say implemented a simple search form. And there you go. From any page that I add to my website, there will always be a search bar at the top of it. If we look into the view source here, we can see what Rails has generated for us in terms of the form. It's given us a form with an action set to the correct result. The method has been set to get. It's added this hidden input, which is that little check mark to test to see if the browser supports UTF-8 to ensure that our encoding is going to work properly. There's the label and the input that were inserted for us, and the submit button itself. There's a few improvements I could make here, and one of them is what I alluded to earlier, which is like this repetition of this code. In the index page, I take all the beers and I loop over them and display a div with a class of beer. In the results page, I do the exact same thing. I now have two places in my code where the HTML display for a beer is encoded. That means if I ever wanted to change how a beer was displayed, I would likely have to change it in two places, which doesn't seem optimal. The Ruby community has always sort of been big on the idea of dry code, where dry stands for don't repeat yourself. I would warn against being overly paranoid about repeating yourself. A little bit of repetition is okay. But Rails specifically has a way of getting rid of this style of view repetition. And it's called a partial. And it's a sort of, you can think of it as like a function, but for ERB. So instead of like a function in code where you're grabbing something that's repetitive, you're grabbing a chunk of ERB that's repeated. And so to remove this repetition, I'm going to go into my beers folder. Even though I'm going to be using it in my search folder, it has to do with the view of a beer. So in the beers folder, I'm going to create a new file. And I'm going to make a file called _beer.html.erb. The underscore means it's a partial. That's how Rails recognizes these partial files that are going to be repeated elsewhere. And then in the index page, I'm going to get rid of the inside of that loop. And I'm going to put that into my partial. So in the partial called beer, I am referencing a variable called beer that has a name and a price and alcohol and an IBU. So I've moved that repetitive code, not the loop though, just the representation of what a beer looks like in terms of HTML. And the variable I use here has to match the name of the file, and the name of the file needs to match the lowercase version of the name of the model. So again, everything has to do with conventions here. So this is a representation of a beer, so the file is called beer, and the variable I'm using inside of it is also called beer. With that in place, I can remove from both the results and the index page that repetitive code. You don't actually, that's the magic of Rails. So I can say render beers. No, that's the nice thing. It's all based on conventions. It knows what happens when the render command executes is it looks at this thing here, and if it's an object of type beer, it'll look into the beer folder for a beer file or an underscore beer file. If it's a collection, it'll say, what's it a collection of? Oh, it's a collection of beers, and then Rails will look in the beers folder and render the beer partial once for every element in that collection. So it's a super powerful thing. And so I can go back now to, for example, my index page, just to make sure it's still working. And there it is. I can search for ale, and it still works. And we've removed that repetition here by just saying render beers. If we now went and implemented a show page for a single beer, we could use that partial again. And so creating partials for things that appear throughout your application saves you a lot of time because you can just then use that partial in all sorts of locations, in your search results, on your display pages, maybe on categorization pages, on show pages, and it's all sort of based on naming conventions. This is very magical, right? This render beers. There is a long form way of working with this. So this short form is just the long. It's this short form of saying render partial. Render partial beer for the collection beers. I think that does the same thing. Let me see. I'll come back to it. I'm just going to see if that renders it twice here. Oops. Missing partial. Oh, yeah, it's. Yeah, so it renders it twice. So the magic is sort of powerful here. It knows which folder to find the thing because I'm in the results. It knows to look in the beers folder. When I do the longer form, I have to specify where that partial is. It's in the beers folder. It's called beer. I don't mention the underscore though. And then I'm saying do it for the collection beers. So that's the long form version of this short form. I will just turn this into a comment so that we don't have it put in there twice. And then before we take a quick peek at CSS, I will use this partial again, but on the show page so that we can see it being used in sort of the singular way where it's just going to render once for a single beer. And so to do that, I'm going to open up my routing file and ask for the show route to be provisioned for me from the resources. So now I'm saying give me resources for beers and only index and show. I can then go back to the beers controller as well as opening up the beers show html.erb. And I probably want to open up the partial as well. I'll do that in a moment. So in the show, I can say beer singular, and I go and find the beer based on its ID, like we've done in the past a few times. The ID is coming from the fact that the route that was provisioned for us is a GET request to /beers/SUMID. So that ID goes into the params hash, and we find it, and we get access to a single beer. We put that into an instance variable, and then the @beer variable will be shared with the app views beers show.html.erb. And then the show is going to be really, really small. It's just going to be a single render statement to render out the partial for the beer. And so if I go to the show, I should be able to delete everything that's in there and just put in a render @beer, which itself is a short form for render beers beer, oh sorry, render partial beers beer for the object just going to test this out. I should be able to go to /beer/SUMID and see the beer in question being displayed by way of that partial. And so again, what I needed to do here was add the show to the routing file in the resources beers command. In the beers controller, I needed to find the beer using the parameter. The @beer variable gets automatically transported over to the associated view, which is the show.html.erb. And inside of that show.html.erb, I've got this render statement. I might now want the, at least in the index form of this, to display a link to, so I'm changing my partial so that the beer name is now a link to the beer so that we can actually get to those show pages. So leveraging my routing system to display a link with the beer name that actually then goes to the route for the beers show action. Just going to test this out. That should display for search results. You can see they're all links now. And it'll also display on the index. Like that. The only thing that's a little bit awkward about what I've implemented is the fact now that even on the show page, the H3 still includes a link to itself, right? So if I'm on the home page and I click on my Duvel here, it's still a link on the show page, even though I'm already on that page. It's not the end of the world. There are ways to pass variables to partials. And so if you think of a partial like it's a function call, we can pass a variable, we could pass a Boolean variable saying like, show this link on some pages versus don't on others. And I won't implement that fully, but the way you would do it is you have to go to the long form and you then, let's just spread this out over a few lines. You pass what are called locals, and that's just a hash of, I could say, show links false. When I render it from the index, oh no, it was the results page where I had the, I'll move that to the index as well. When I render this on the index, I would have to also render it out in its long form like this. And I can pass with that, it needs to be a comma, locals, as in local variables, show links true. And then within my partial, I would have access to a show links variable that I could use as with an if statement. Do I want to show this link or do I not want to show this link? It makes it so you don't get to fully leverage the beautiful magic of the render command. But sometimes it's nice to remove those magics and make things explicit anyways. And the last thing I was going to show today is I will capture these changes here. I will say implemented a partial for a beer and used it on a few pages. Last but not least is the idea of where would we put CSS? How would we use CSS in this application? In every Rails project, there is a app assets folder. And in that app assets folder is a style sheets folder. There is a main style sheet called application CSS. We don't tend to put anything in there. Then for every controller, there is a separate place to put sort of code that's associated with the views for that controller, CSS code. So there's a beers and a search. Notice that they are called SCSS files, and that is Sass. And so if you aren't familiar with Sass, go to sasslang.com and you can learn all about Sassy CSS, which is a improvement to CSS that Rails will automatically compile down to CSS for you. So the browsers don't speak Sass, so you can write your style sheets in Sass and then Rails will compile it to CSS for delivery to the browser. Where do I want? Maybe learn. Some of the nice things that Sass provides: variables. That's pretty nice. Having variables in CSS, you can have like a font stack captured in a variable or a color, so you can put your brand colors, and if the brand changes, you only have to change it in one place and wherever you've used that variable. There's little mathematical functions, so you could have brand colors, and then there's the ability to call like darken and lighten and various hues. You can do nesting, so instead of like, if I had like a UL with an LI that had a particular class on it, and then inside of there like an EM, and I wanted to apply some CSS to those things, that's how we would do it in ordinary CSS. In Sass, we can actually nest. And that gives us the ability to add other styles along the way. So I could say like the styles associated with LIs that are inside of ULs will be this, and then further, or maybe even with like a dot class on it, this one was beer, and then further EMs will have extra things. I really like this. It's finally my style sheets match the hierarchy of the associated HTML. So I think that nesting is a really nice feature of Sass. You get partials, which are similar to the partials in Rails, so just like the ability to capture repetitive CSS. You get mixins, which are like functions for CSS, which are really, really nice, especially when new things get added to CSS and they start off as like vendor prefixed things, and then they go beyond their vendor prefixing. Having the ability to create a mix-in. So here you would pass in, here's a mix-in called transform. You pass in a property and it generates 3 different rules based on that property, the transform command and then 2 vendor prefixed versions of that command. And then you use that within your CSS. When the vendor prefixed versions go away, you just remove them from your mix-in and your style sheets are updated automatically. You get the ability to do a little bit of like object orientation with your CSS. So you get sort of can set up some CSS properties and extend or inherit from them. It's just a really nice addition to CSS. You can do a bunch of math. So you can do plus and minus and percent and multiply and divide with elements for padding and whatnot. So you could have a variable that is sort of a set padding amount, and then you can use that throughout your CSS with a variety of math sort of to keep things sort of all nicely patterned down to one single variable for maybe how you're dealing with widths and margins and things like that. You don't have to use SCSS. If you put regular old CSS in these files, that still works, right? So it's not forcing you to use SCSS, but it's giving you the ability to use it if you wanted to. Even though Rails breaks this down into multiple different files, like a beers file and a search file, all of the code, that's just for organization purposes. All of the CSS code is included on all pages. So it's not just that the search SCSS only shows up on the search views, it just always shows up everywhere. But it just gives you a place to put it. And so, for example, if I went in here and I said that, what's that? Oh, that's a good question. That's important for CSS, and I don't know the answer. We could test that out though, but we would only have 2 to work with. My guess is alphabetical. They're all included from this. This is the weirdest part about Rails. This CSS file, these comments right here that have extra equals in front of them are actually executable code. And what this means is that Rails will require all files in this folder, and it will require this file itself. And so if we removed this, it would no longer include these in our style sheets. But yeah, I don't know the order in which it is added. Then, okay. So yeah, I'm guessing alphabetical by default. And so if I went in here and I said like my div of class beer that I've set up, I had like what inside of my div of class beer? I'll make it blue. I'll make the price blue or all of the text blue for the class beer. So color blue. And then I go back over here and I reload, and now it's blue. So it works just as you would expect CSS to work. You don't have to use SCSS, but you have the ability to use SCSS if you wish to. If you want to use a framework like Bootstrap, for example, there is a gem that makes bringing Bootstrap into your project a little bit easier. And so you would just search for gem Bootstrap. And it is the second one that shows up for me, at least on DuckDuckGo. It's the Bootstrap Ruby gem, not the Bootstrap Sass gem. And it's just a gem that you put into your gem file, and it brings Bootstrap into your project. There's a few installation steps that you have to follow, and they're provided in the README file. And they're slightly more complicated if you want to bring in Bootstrap's ability to do some more dynamic stuff, because Bootstrap has, for some of its more dynamic stuff like pop-up modals, it has a dependency on jQuery, and Rails does not include jQuery. It used to in the past, but doesn't anymore. So if you want even fancier Bootstrap stuff that goes beyond just the layout and goes into some interaction stuff that jQuery adds to Bootstrap, there's further instructions. But if you just want the styling itself, you just have to follow the very initial steps that it tells you, which are just these right here. And so it's a really quick way of getting the Bootstrap framework into your project. There are extra marks if you use Bootstrap on your project with a minimum that you've made some use of the Bootstrap grid system. So just adding Bootstrap to your project isn't enough. So at a minimum, your layout, the layout of your page, has to be based around Bootstrap's grid system, which is, that's not a hugely difficult thing to do, especially if you do it from the beginning on. So if you haven't had an opportunity to work with Bootstrap before, you probably want to take this opportunity. It's still a very popular framework. If you've already worked with Bootstrap, you might want to branch out and try experimenting with some other frameworks around there. Sorry? No, I mean like CSS frameworks. So there's like Semantic UI, there's Bulma, there's Tailwinds. There's a whole bunch of different CSS frameworks that you might want to play around with if you're already familiar with Bootstrap. If you're not already familiar with Bootstrap, I would stick with it because adding it to a Rails project is fairly simple. So that's all I got for you for today. Like usual, there's a lot to take in. I did record a video here, so I will post that up to Learn and YouTube. And yeah, thank you very much for coming to class today and listening to me talk about a lot of things.